Here we are with chapter 14, creating a nation. And so we think about the Articles of Confederation. So these were passed July 11th, 1776, and they were adopted about a year later by the Second Continental Congress, and it wasn't until 1781 that actually ratified by the states. So the Battle of Yorktown is October 1781. The Treaty of Paris, which officially ends the American Revolution, is 1783. So in the early 1780s is when we get the Articles of Confederation. But there are some issues with the Articles of Confederation. So again, this was the governing document, the Constitution of the United States, if you will. But it had three issues: lack of power, lack of trade and commerce, and lack of stable currency. And so a lot of issues with the lack of power is it didn't fully detail all the different issues that the federal government would face in the future. One of the most pressing ones was the federal government had the ability to pass a tax, but it was not detailed that they could collect the tax. And the Articles of Confederation were not amendable. So you could not amend these to address these issues. So it did not provide some of the power that the federal government needed to operate. In terms of lack in trade and commerce, it also didn't fully detail, is it one nation that enters into trade agreements, or is it 13 individual states? Because again, while it was the United States of America, it really was the United States. It was the state was the primary component of the Articles of Confederation. Even though the Articles of Confederation were the law of the land, states were the primary component. And so it's led for trade difficulties in terms of, could states sign their own trade agreements with other countries, or did it have to be collectively and as the United States? And third was a lack of stable currency. This was a major issue in that they started to make their own currency, the Continental, but they printed so much of this that it actually became not very valuable. And so that was a major issue they had. And so it came to the need to create a new constitution. So in May 1787, delegates from each state met in what was the Constitutional Convention. And some of the goals they had was to remove obstacles to block economic growth and expansion. They wanted power to levy and collect taxes for the federal government, and they wanted to establish property rights and protection from government infringement. So it's still this battle between states' rights and federal rights to set up. And so what to do? Well, originally it was the Virginia plan that was presented first, and then the New Jersey plan followed. So let's start with the New Jersey plan, since that's non-chronological order. So the New Jersey plan was focused to revise the Articles of Confederation. That was the foundation they wanted to build upon, and just make some changes. So each state would get one representative in Congress that was elected by a state legislature. So each state had one vote in Congress. Congress would be authorized to raise money through taxation, but Congress could also request money from states. And so states, based on their population, would have to pay the federal government. The Congress, one from each state, would appoint an executive committee, not just one single executive, but it could be multiple executives to service that. That executive committee would appoint the federal judiciary branch, and the Articles of the Supreme Law of the land. So it was really just taking what was already set with the Articles of Confederation and just modifying them a little bit. The second plan was the Virginia plan. And this was really, while it was pitched as just a modification of the Articles of Confederation, it really was a new constitution. Rather than a single Congress, it had a bicameral legislative branch, where members of the House of Representatives, or the first branch is what it was called, were elected by the people for a 3-year term, and the Senate would be elected by the House by a 7-year term. But both of these houses would be selected based on population, or what was called quotas of contribution, which is a measure of wealth of the state, or the taxes that the state paid. The national legislature would select the executive branch to serve a single term, and there was a judicial system. So these were debated. Hamilton, we'll talk about it, Hamilton Jefferson had some very fantastic views on the issue. But what eventually gets adopted is what's called the Connecticut Compromise, the Connecticut Plan, which tries to find this compromise. And it establishes 7 articles with the preamble starting "We the People" that establishes the U.S. Constitution. So the first article sets up Congress, a bicameral Congress. So we have a House of Representatives selected based on population by the people. And then we had a second house, a Senate, which was selected based on equal representation. So each state would get 2 senators, and each state would get different number of representatives based off of their population. And both these houses then would create the laws. They had to do it jointly. Powers of Congress were clearly delineated in Section 8. So I encourage you to look at that up. If you go on the previous, you can Google U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, and it'll tell you what those powers are. The second is the presidency. So this president would serve a term of 4 years. There was no term limits at this time. They could be reelected. And they were selected by the famous Electoral College. Yeah, every 4 years we have debate whether we should do this or not. But what it meant is that each state would get the number of electorates that matched the number of representatives plus senators. And once you have a president, that president would appoint judges with Senate approval. They would also give a State of the Union. And Section 4 is this terminology that's been in the press a lot lately as President Trump recently passed through the impeachment process twice and was then judged by the Senate to be removed from office. But the wording here is that the president could be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And so then it's up to the Senate to identify was the impeachment offenses meeting this bar. For President Trump, both times he was impeached, the Senate voted that that the impeachment accusations did not meet this bar to be removed from office. The Article 3 talks about the judicial branch. So the Supreme Court is established with inferior courts. Section 2 talks about what cases the Supreme Court will hear. They won't hear every case. There's only specific cases, and that's why oftentimes cases are petitioned to the Supreme Court, and they don't have to choose to listen to them or not, depending if they meet certain criteria as established in Article 3 of the Constitution. Now we're going to skip forward, but number 5 is really important, is the amendment process. Is to pass an amendment, 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and 3/4 of the states have to ratify. And when that's happened, that shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, meaning that with any amendment, it is as if that is Constitution. So we have the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments. That is officially part of the Constitution. We now have further amendments. We'll talk about those as we go through the class, but every amendment is as if it is a part of the U.S. Constitution. But here's the challenge that we want to talk about. Now, this is not in the book yet. It'll be in the next edition. But I want you to be aware of this because it's actually really important. The challenge is how do we count people? Because the House of Representatives needed to be based on population. But there wasn't a system to count people. So they established a census. So August 2nd, 1790 was dubbed Census Day, in which every household was to be visited and to complete a survey to count how many people should live or how lived within each state and within each jurisdiction. The South argued that slaves should be counted. The North argues that slaves were property, should not be counted. And so it set up this really big debate. And this was important because if you don't count the slaves, the North is going to dominate the House of Representatives, which is going to give them more power in Congress. But if you count the slaves, the South is going to have much power. And so the compromise was reached that slaves should be counted as 3/5 of a person. And that then sets up this challenge of, well, what is it we're actually counting? So the very first census had 5 inquiries. You had these questions: number of free white males of 16 years and upward, free white males under 16 years, free white females, all other free persons, and then slaves. And it slowly transitioned. So here's actually a picture of the total count from the original census of 1790. You see the populations by state. But it then changes this issue of how do we count blacks? And so we have these issues. So in 1850, they count blacks. They count what they called mulattoes. This black and at least one other race. They counted black slaves and mulatto slaves. So now they're distinguishing between slaves that are black and free individuals who are black. In 1890, they had this rule they called the quadroon, which is 1/4 black blood. So if one of your grandparents was black and the other 3 were white, you'd be considered a quadroon. Or you could be an octoroon, 1/8, or what they called any trace of black blood. By 1930, they actually in the census they drop this 1-drop rule, or a person of mixed and white and Negro blood would be returned as a Negro, no matter the percentage. And so it's really, or they adopted what they call a 1-drop rule. And so really interesting how they've dealt with issues of race over time. In terms of, it's not just blacks, but Native Americans was a category was called Indian in 1860. American Indians was added in 1890. Aleut and Eskimos was added in 1960. In 2000 is when it was added American Indian or Alaskan Native, or a blank space to be able to specify your tribe. Asian originally shows up in the census in 1870 as the category of Chinese was added. In 1910, another category. 1920 to 40, to classify Asians, they had Hindus as a category. Pacific Islanders was created in 1960 to 1990. And they had different categories: Hawaiian, part Hawaiian, Samoan, Guamanian. In 2000, they just classified it as Pacific Islanders. Hispanics was a category added in 1930, and Hispanic origin was added in 1970. So we see the modification of these questions in race about the census through time. And why that's important is because they wanted to count these people originally based off of this 3/5 rule for slaves. But then we have in 1868 the 14th Amendment, which provides equal protections of the law to all individuals, all persons born or naturalized in the United States. And so because of this, there now became these serious challenges. And with Section 2 is we still have this idea that representatives will be apportioned based on population. And so one of the most interesting cases is a case called Plessy v. Ferguson. So Louisiana had racial segregation laws in 1890, and they passed this that provided a separate rail car carriages for whites and for colored races. And so they were separate. In 1892, Homer Plessy refused to sit in the car designated for Negroes, and they sat in the car designated for whites. And the reason was, of his 8 grandparents, 7 of them were white. Homer Plessy believed that he was white because 7/8 of him was. 1/8 of him was Negro, but he identified as being white. And that created this challenge. So here's a picture of him. You can determine what you think he might look like, but this was, he was officially called an octoroon, but he classified the lawsuit that he was white and could therefore sit in the white car because he was 7/8 Caucasian. But that wasn't enough. And so in the ruling Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court ruled and declared that the law was created as separate but equal was constitutional. And this then is building upon many of the issues of the Civil War, of Jim Crow laws, and this is going to further exacerbate that now states can create laws where they say, hey, we have separate for blacks and whites, but we're going to call them equal, even though they're really not. So here is Henry Billings Brown, the Supreme Court at the time. We consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the 2 races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by any reason anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. So it's very strong words that, in a sense, we might consider racist today. But citing precedent, which is interesting, to assert separateness is not to declare inferiority. It is simply to say that following the order of divine providence, human authority ought not to compel these widely separate races to intermix. So this was the precedent of a state law from Pennsylvania, that it's not that they're inferior, it's just that divine providence has identified these as 2 separate races, and they should not intermix. Clearly, the precedent was based on what we would call today, and I think even not too far past, racist foundations. That it's divine providence, it's God that establishes the differences between these races. Therefore, it's okay to separate them with legal laws. As a result, this created constitutional justifications for segregation in Jim Crow laws. And it's not until 1954, Brown v. Board of Education, that it's ruled that separate but equal is unconstitutional in the educational setting, and then it slowly is going to trickle out through others. So Plessy v. Ferguson is a very influential case when it comes to race in the United States. And so when we think about these decisions made in 1790 of how do we count blacks, how do we count slaves particularly, and that 3/5 compromise of how to count them for the terms of state representatives had long-term impacts on our nation. And as a result has struggled a lot with how do we use the census to calculate race. Recently, a controversy arose again is, well, should we count illegal immigrants or undocumented individuals in our country within the census? For all time, we've counted that. And this last census, that was a very large debate. So things decided in 1790 had a big impact on us today. So this was a little longer, but I wanted to add that part on the census because I think it's really important and it's not in the book.